All right, hello and welcome to this training. As you can see from the title, what we're going to be covering is how to design your brain for unbreakable discipline. And as you can see from the overview, what we're going to be talking about more specifically is first the overview itself, decoding inner resistance, the high-octane dopamine protocol, identity architecture, and intrinsic fuel, precision, execution, triggers, the review, and your action items for the day or the next few days. Now, before we get started, if you want this document along with the training, then make sure to join the free community from the description. If you want to work with me one-on-one, then make sure to book a call from the link in the description. And if you want to join the newsletter so you can receive weekly emails straight to your inbox with tips on health, wealth, love, and self, then make sure to join the newsletter from the link in the description. With that said, if you like content like this, then make sure to subscribe, like, comment below what you'd like to see next. And with that out of the way, let's get started and talk about decoding inner resistance. So there's this concept in biology called homeostasis, and it's basically the idea that every living system, your body included, has this deep, almost obsessive need to maintain internal stability. Your body and your body temperature stays around 36 to 37 degrees Celsius or 96.8 Fahrenheit to 98.6 Fahrenheit. Your blood sugar levels stay within a certain range as well. Your heart rate adjusts itself. All of this happens automatically without you even really thinking about it. And the thing is, if anything threatens to knock these systems out of balance, your body will fight back. You start sweating when you're too hot, for example, or you shiver when you're too cold, and you get hungry when your blood sugar drops. And this is kind of oversimplified, but you get the idea, right? These aren't choices that you have to consciously make. They're automatic defense mechanisms that are really designed to keep you in a stable, comfortable state. Now, on the surface, this seems like it has nothing to do with discipline or really getting things done, but stay with me here and you'll get the idea. The reason I'm mentioning homeostasis is because your brain operates on the exact same principle, not just physically, but psychologically. Your mind has what you might call a psychological homeostasis, a baseline level of comfort, stimulation, and effort that it considers normal. And just like your body fights to keep your temperature stable, your brain will fight you to keep your psychological state stable. So when you try to do something hard, something that requires a bit more effort or discomfort than your current baseline, well, your brain interprets that as a threat to equilibrium. It sees hard work not as an opportunity, but rather a disruption. And this is exactly why resistance really feels so automatic and so powerful. It's not that you're necessarily weak or lazy, it's that your brain is doing exactly what it evolved to do, which is to protect the current state at all costs. The discomfort you feel when facing a hard task is literally your brain's version of shivering or sweating. It's a defense mechanism. Once you understand this, you'll stop fighting yourself and start working with your own biology. Which brings us to the interesting part, right? If your brain treats change as a threat, then the path to discipline isn't about forcing yourself through that response. I mean, it can be a path, but not the best. It's about lowering the perceived threat in the first place. You have to basically make the hard thing feel less like a disruption to your equilibrium and more like a natural extension of it. And that's what this entire section is really about, understanding the mechanisms that create resistance so you can sidestep them instead of bulldozing through them. So look, before you can beat any enemy, you have to actually understand what you're fighting, right? And the enemy here is living inside your own head, rent-free, quietly sabotaging you every single day. There are two main forces at play: emotional meltdown and ego buffering. And once you understand how these work, you can actually start tricking your brain into seeing hard work as a reward instead of a threat. Now, we're wired to avoid pain, so we need to change how your brain perceives the work itself. And this section is kind of going to break down the sneaky ways your brain fights progress, and it will give you a framework to take back control. Now, you can think of your brain like a moody, spoiled teenager who basically throws a tantrum whenever it has to deal with any chores, homework, or literally any inconvenience. This resistance shows up as procrastination or feeling tired for no reason, and this just overwhelming urge to do something easy. Now, the key is understanding that this is just a natural response. Because what happens is the moment a task feels stressful or boring, your brain immediately overestimates the difficulty. And that triggers the urge to put it off. Your brain is simply seeking the path of least resistance, trying to keep things easy. And so when your brain doesn't get its way, when you try to force yourself into a difficult task, it complains and throws a metaphorical fit. It resists you basically head on. And this internal battle against your brain's natural response is usually pointless, which means the ultimate goal of all this resistance is to keep you exactly where you are. Your brain wants you to avoid the struggle and the discomfort that hard work requires. And it's protecting you, but in a way that basically keeps you stuck. And in his book, The War of Art, Stephen Pressfield actually describes resistance as an invisible, universal force that exists solely to prevent you from doing your most important work. It's impersonal and it affects everyone, like the brain's protective mechanisms we're talking about here, right? Resistance doesn't care about your potential. It only wants to maintain the status quo, the equilibrium, the homeostasis, whatever you want to call it, and to keep you comfortable. And on top of that, the sheer dread of a task often grows exponentially with how big it seems. So committing to writing an entire book feels way more overwhelming than committing to a Netflix marathon, even though the marathon actually wastes way more time. Because what's happening is your mind does this rapid, almost visual calculation of how much effort and struggle it will take to reach that distant goal. And the problem is this mental calculation almost always overestimates the pain and undersells the reward. So your brain just shuts down, right? But that's not all. Resistance also comes from your fragile ego, which basically acts like a shield designed to protect your self-image at all costs, especially from embarrassment or failure. So the ego guards the image you've attached your self-worth to, which means any action that risks failure gets subconsciously avoided. So if you've built an identity around being gifted or special, the thought of doing something outside of your comfort zone where you might actually fail is terrifying to the ego. Your ego knows that if you fail, your whole self-image gets destroyed. So it resists the hard thing entirely just to preserve who you think you are. And this fear of really getting your ego bruised is so powerful that your brain would rather skip something valuable than upload a video outside of your niche, for example, or try a new thing that you might suck at, right? It sees failure as a catastrophic identity event, not as a learning opportunity. Because ultimately, every action, every feeling, every behavior you have is consistent with the beliefs you hold about yourself. If the hard task conflicts with your current identity, your brain will fight it hard, right? Which is why, to preserve your self-image, you'll find countless ways to avoid the hard thing. You'll make sure you never put your perceived talent or worth on the line. And this will keep you safe, sure, but it also keeps you completely stationary, trapped by basically a story you've built about yourself. And the thing is, this ego-driven resistance has nothing to do with your physical ability. You can physically run a mile regardless of what you believe, but the ego dictates whether you'll even try. It puts up barriers because it's fundamentally afraid of failing and shattering that internal narrative. So, trying to fight these forces head on with sheer willpower is exhausting, and it usually doesn't work. You can't just demand more discipline and expect to overcome deep-seated emotional and ego resistance, right? You need a strategy, which means the real path forward involves figuring out where the resistance is coming from and then changing your whole approach, right? You trick your brain into working with you instead of against you. This means lowering the perceived stakes so that the emotional overwhelm just melts away. Because what you're doing here is basically neuroalchemy. You're using specific behavioral and cognitive tricks to transform undesirable activities into things you actually crave. You're not defeating your survival mechanisms through brute force, you're actually outsmarting them instead. So with that said, let's discuss the high-octane dopamine protocol. So if you want high-impact execution, you have to optimize your internal chemistry first. You can't fire a high-powered engine on cheap, watery fuel. Dopamine is the neurotransmitter that is responsible for craving, motivation, and reward, and managing it is honestly the biggest cheat code to becoming relentlessly successful. When your brain is constantly depleted because of easily accessed pleasure, it just doesn't have the resources to find hard work desirable. This section is going to be your basically battle plan for reclaiming your dopamine stores and using the pleasure-pain balance to turn discomfort into fuel. Now, a depleted brain will always default to ease. It chases fast, cheap dopamine to escape the discomfort of being in a low energy state, right? And if you're routinely engaging in a hyper-stimulating activity or hyper stimulating activities like excessive scrolling, junk food, or gaming, your baseline dopamine is way too high. Now, this matters because engaging in these fast dopamine activities causes a massive spike in pleasure, followed inevitably by a crash below your normal baseline, right? This plummet basically puts you into a dopamine deficit state where hard tasks feel overwhelmingly difficult and totally undesirable, which then creates a vicious cycle. Fast dopamine leads to deficit, you fail hard at work, you criticize yourself, and then you seek more fast dopamine to escape the self-hatred, right? You have to break this pattern if you ever want hard work to feel really appealing. And because of this, when your dopamine baseline is high, the low dopamine behaviors that actually lead to success, like deep work, reading, or exercise, actually feel incredibly boring and impossible to start. Your brain has become accustomed to a level of stimulation that work simply cannot match, because work doesn't have those constant dopamine hits, right? So naturally, the solution is to aggressively reclaim your dopamine by purging like 90% of fast dopamine sources from your life. Ask yourself, what makes me feel good immediately but leaves me drained and groggy afterwards? And if you have trouble identifying these things, which you shouldn't have trouble, but if you do, here are a few examples: alcohol, video games, watching porn, etc., right? Because this is the elimination phase. You ruthlessly identify and remove all the furnaces of waste that are burning away your daily power meter for frivolous temporary satisfaction. And this might be digital media, it might be mindless consumption, or anything else that's really engineered to give you maximum dopamine per minute. But you also have to consider the flip side, right? You have to leverage the pleasure-pain balance. While fast dopamine leads to a crash, activities that involve pain first will reward you later. And this is the key to lasting sustainable motivation. See, activities that required upfront effort, what we call slow dopamine activities, tilt the balance towards pain initially. But once you stop, the neurochemistry shifts and rewards you with feelings of accomplishment and well-being. So a hard workout, for example, can hurt at the beginning, but leaves you feeling amazing afterwards. So you can think of this as a dopamine fast. By basically removing all the stimulation, you manipulate your brain so it becomes so hungry that it really finds immense pleasure in the carrot, quote unquote, of hard work. So just like fasting from food makes even a boring meal taste incredible, fasting from instant pleasure makes focus rewarding. The truth is, when you unplug from fast dopamine, you'll feel worse before you feel better. You'll enter a period of discomfort and anxiety as your brain readjusts to a lower baseline. And this initial 1 to 3 days of suffering, quote unquote, is the necessary price that you need to pay. And along with that, when you remove a highly stimulating bad behavior, you have to compensate for the loss of stimulation by replacing it with something healthy. And this intentional compensation will reduce the emotional gap and it will make it way easier to stick to the change. So for example, if you remove 30 units of stimulation from short form content, you need to immediately replace it with 15 units of stimulation from exercise or cold exposure, for example. Your net loss is only 15 units, which makes the transition manageable. The smaller the negative baseline change, the easier it is to maintain new habits and avoid relapse. But ultimately, the biggest barrier is the discomfort you feel while doing the hard thing. And the master move is to really actively redefine that feeling. It's the currency you pay for growth, for power, for clarity, for success. So this is why you need to use powerful self-talk to reappraise the discomfort and tell yourself that the pain you feel is exactly what most people quit over. It's, for example, proving that you're persisting towards the reward. So, for example, every time you say to yourself that you don't feel like it, your immediate response has to be good. That means I must do it, right? This transforms the pain into a trigger for action. And you stop running from resistance and actually start chasing it as fuel. You start welcoming it. Because in the end, the discomfort of deep work, studying, or resisting social media is the necessary pain that's required to experience long-lasting rewards when the activity is actually complete. So this mindset shift will just reframe the struggle as a key component of success. It makes the struggle actually desirable. Now, if you're serious about implementing this and you want help building a personalized system around your dopamine management and your discipline, I work with people one-on-one to make this actually happen. So book a call from the link in the description and let's talk about what that could look like for you. Now, with that said, let's talk about the identity architecture and intrinsic fuel. So there's this principle in finance called compound interest, and it's been called the eighth wonder of the world for a good reason. The way this works is when you invest money, you earn interest on that money. But then the next period, you earn interest not just on your original investment, but also on the interest you already earned. And then the next period, you earn interest on all of that. Over time, this creates an exponential growth that seems almost magical, right? So a small amount invested today, left alone for decades, can actually turn into a fortune. Now, the key isn't the size of the initial investment, it's the consistency over time and the fact that gains build on gains. Now, what does this have to do with identity and motivation? Well, everything. See, the reason compound interest matters here is because identity works the exact same way. Every action you take is like a small deposit into an identity account. One workout doesn't make you fit. One healthy meal doesn't make you healthy. 1 hour of deep work doesn't necessarily make you disciplined. But the thing is, each of those actions earn interest in the form of reinforced neural pathways, stronger self-belief, and increased likelihood of repeating the behavior. And then the next action builds on that. Over time, all these tiny deposits will compound into something massive, a rock-solid identity that makes hard work feel natural, right? And this is exactly why people who focus on identity change succeed while others fail. They understand that they're not trying to win a single battle. They're making consistent deposits that compound over time. The person who does 1 push-up every day for a year actually has a stronger athlete identity than the person who does 500 push-ups once and then quits, right? It's not about the intensity of any single action. It's about the compounding effect of the consistency itself. And the part most people miss is compound interest is boring at the start. It always is. That's the point of it. The gains will always feel tiny. You look at your account after a year and you think, oh my God, that's it. But that's exactly when most people pull out, right? They don't have the patience to wait for the exponential curve to actually kick in. And the same thing happens with identity change. The first few weeks always feel pointless, but if you stay consistent, you eventually hit the inflection point where everything starts to basically accelerate. And that's what this section is really about, understanding how to make strategic identity deposits that compound into unstoppable momentum. So with that in mind, you cannot outperform your self-image. The path to effortless hard work actually lies in deliberately redesigning who you believe you are. The catch is that identity without evidence is just fragile fantasy, right? You have to intentionally cast votes with your daily actions to establish the identity of the person you want to become. Plus, sustained and relentless drive doesn't come from external rewards. It comes from tapping into the self-sustaining power of intrinsic motivation. And this is how you actually shift from being externally driven by temporary boosts like a new car or a new watch and so on, to being powered by your own perpetual motivational engine. And that starts with understanding that all lasting behavior change is fundamentally identity-based, or at least self-image based. If you change the beliefs you hold about yourself, your behavior will follow. Your goal isn't merely to tick off a difficult task, it's to become the type of person who actually performs that task consistently with no issue, right? Which means you need to cast enough votes with consistent action over at least a week to give your brain the evidence required to start forming that new identity. Without this evidence, any attempt to gaslight yourself into believing you're a certain type of person will fail. Your brain will always call it BS. So be precise with your internal language. Shift the narrative from I need to work out and get in shape to, which is kind of a scarcity mindset anyway, to I'm a person who actually works out, which is more of an abundance mindset, right? The latter actually aligns the action with your self-image and removes mental resistance. And this works because human beings have an innate drive to remain intellectually consistent. So if you identify as an active person, going to the gym naturally becomes just something you do. It's not something outside of yourself that you have to force. But identity alone isn't enough. So extrinsic motivation, relying on money, status, or praise only works temporarily. It's like fossil fuels that eventually run out because the reward is outside of the activity itself. True long-lasting motivation is intrinsic. It comes from elements like curiosity, purpose, and mastery, and it makes hard work actually easy. So take mastery, for example. This is the relentless pursuit of excellence and continuous improvement. It's what drives you to keep practicing. Identify the key skills that actually advance your long-term goals, and then practice them deliberately at the edge of your comfort zone. And as you do this, mastery involves seeking out greater challenges and as your skills improve, which create an upward spiral of growth and engagement that is fueled by dopamine and endorphins. So in practice, ask yourself what a top performer or an athlete would do in a moment of low motivation, and then align your current choice with the identity you're actually building. They prioritize the process, not the fantasy of the outcome, right? Then there's autotelicity. And this is the pure love for the activities you do, doing them for their own sake rather than for an external result. So to boost this, actually focus on tasks that you're uniquely good at, because strengths are a trigger for flow. And the more time you spend in flow, the more you come to love that activity. And when autotelicity is present, the line between work and play actually blurs, and you find yourself spontaneously diving into core work activities without even needing a deadline or having any external obligations. The activity itself becomes the reward, which is actually why you need to stop generating motivation by fantasizing about the end goal, whether that's having a Greek god physique or having a millionaire status. That fantasy is a completely different and actually much easier sensation than the strenuous, sweaty process required to actually get there. You have to find pleasure and fulfillment in the daily discipline itself. And where it all comes together is when you actually engage all these intrinsic motivators, they release performance-enhancing neurochemicals that trigger the flow state. Flow, in turn, is your intrinsic motivation, and it initiates a virtuous cycle where motivation feeds flow and flow feeds motivation, which leads to unbreakable drive and discipline, right? And if you want to go deeper on this and actually build a system that sticks, I'd love to help you do that. I work with people one-on-one to design exactly this kind of transformation. So if it sounds like something you need, book a call from the link in the description and we'll figure out the best plan forward for you. Now, with that said, let's talk about precision execution triggers. So consistent action leads to progress, which naturally kicks in motivation. You just need to initiate the process long enough to actually build momentum. And the battle against resistance is won in the first few minutes. So you need infallible, repeatable mechanisms that bypass overthinking and emotional resistance. So this section gives you the practical, strategic tricks you can use immediately to make starting so easy that skipping the work feels basically illogical. So to start with the 2-minute rule, which is fundamentally about convincing your brain to do the task for just 2 minutes. You're lowering the stakes so much so that the negative emotions around starting don't feel that overwhelming. And this will transform a daunting leap into a tiny, totally doable hop. Now, in practice, instead of committing to the entire gym session, just start with one set of push-ups. Instead of writing the entire essay, just write one sentence. The mind is much more likely to follow through when the challenge is broken down into small, non-threatening steps, right? And then once the 2 minutes are actually complete, pause and really reevaluate how you feel. Chances are it wasn't nearly as bad as you imagined, and doing another small segment doesn't sound terrifying anymore. So before you know it, you've tricked yourself into completing a whole workout or a whole chapter. Or if you're feeling overwhelmingly intimidated, then just break the task down to just 5% of its totality, right? Ask yourself, where does my willingness to do this task begin? Now, another powerful technique is the play dress up or activation trick, which is about physically going through the motions of preparation without mentally committing to the actual work. Now, this leverages physical movement to overcome mental resistance. So if you feel resistance towards working out, just change into your shorts, lace up your shoes and grab your keys. That's all you have to do. And then tell yourself you're just prepping, not actually doing the work, right? Often, simply going through these physical motions is enough to convince yourself that since you're already ready, you might as well follow through. And the same applies to studying. Don't tell yourself you're going to study. Just open your textbook, pull up your study schedule, and get your calculator out, for example. You don't actually have to go and study. And what this does is it uses the inertia of physical action to build momentum before the brain can actually put up serious resistance. And because at the end of the day, action kills overthinking. Hesitation is the enemy of transformation. So implement the 3-second kill switch, which is when you hesitate, count from 3 to 1. So 3, 2, 1. and then just move instantly. Force your brain to submit and follow the action. Now, beyond that, use a strategic reward system by actually batching difficult work with enjoyable work. So you can actually speak to your brain like the spoiled child it sometimes is. You have to incentivize hard work with something pleasurable so that the negative emotions associated with the task actually get softened. So you identify a desired pleasure. It can be some kind of a habit you do often, like an indulgence, like coffee or an album you want to listen to, and leverage that enjoyment by actually allowing yourself the pleasure only when performing the hard task. Now, what this will do is it will create a positive Pavlovian association with a difficult behavior. For example, if you love coffee, allow yourself to drink it only while reading the book you need to finish. What this does is it actually makes sure that the positive sensation of coffee is paired with the difficult task. And eventually, the action of opening the book itself becomes a natural and pleasant ritual separate from the initial pleasure, right? Or those who love music, allow yourself to listen to that favorite album only when, for example, you're hitting the gym. You're effectively borrowing the intense dopaminergic surge from the music and then transferring it onto the formerly painful activity. And building on that, develop a keystone habit, a simple action you do immediately before the hard thing that basically signals to your brain it's time to perform. Now, what this will do is it will prime your brain and make the transition into hard work basically seamless. So for some, this might be making a specific type of tea or pouring electrolytes before heading to the gym. The brain automatically starts to associate this simple act with entering a focused state. So any routine that is done consistently and sincerely enough eventually transcends the mundane and becomes a sacred, powerful ritual, right? But remember, never set a pace you can't actually sustain. The consistent plan you follow is always better than the perfect, exhausting plan you abandon after one session. So finally, your tomorrow is created by the decisions you make today, especially in the evening. So spending your evenings chasing fast dopamine activities ensures that you basically wake up in a deficit state, already losing the battle. So focus on creating a solid wind down routine that actually eliminates all these fast dopamine sources. And you can do it right now. Like, go on your phone and completely delete everything and give your brain some space to return to baseline and prepare for sleep. Plan for 8 hours of sleep plus an hour margin for winding down. Fighting those biological needs is actually really a losing game. A body that follows a rhythm, which is spiking cortisol upon waking up and melatonin before bed, is a body that's actually ready for deep work. And along with that, implement a policy of making no major decisions or taking stressful phone calls or having any difficult conversations after a certain hour. This will just prevent all that worrying and all these obsessive thoughts that you might have from hijacking your brain before you actually start resting. So with that said, let's go over the review. We talked about the overview. We talked about decoding inner resistance, the high-octane dopamine protocol, identity architecture and intrinsic fuel, precision execution triggers, the review, and your action items for the day or the next few days. First, execute a ruthless dopamine audit immediately and identify and eliminate 90% of the fast, high stimulation activities that are robbing your capacity for hard work. And define the identity of the person who successfully performs the hard thing and use your next 3 decisions to cast tangible votes in favor of that new self-image. And then finally, choose the 2-minute rule or a strategic keystone habit to tackle your single hardest task first thing tomorrow morning. With that said, thank you for being here. I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to subscribe, like, comment below to let me know what you'd like to see next. Again, if you want this training along with this document, then make sure to join the free community from the link in the description. And if you want to work with me one-on-one, make sure to book a call from the link in the description. And if you want weekly newsletters with tips on improving your health, wealth, love, and self, then make sure to join the newsletter, again, from the link in the description. Once again, thank you for being here, and I'm going to see you in the next one.